In this presentation, we will continue going through the company preferences, this time concentrating in on the reminders and the reports and graphs within QuickBooks Pro 2020, QuickBooks Desktop 2020. Here we are in our Get Great Guitars file. We're now going to go to the preferences by selecting the edit dropdown and going down to the preferences at the bottom. Within the preferences, last time we left off on the payroll and employees. This time we're going to scroll down to the reminders. Within the reminders in the My Preferences, we have Show Reminders List with Open a New Company. I'm going to keep the default setting as No. And then we're going to go to the company preferences on the right. And of course, you can experiment with that if it would be something useful to you. Now, as we go through this practice problem, just note that the reminders oftentimes are not going to be something useful to us because many of them have to do with timings and date and time type of information. And we're going to have to work in some date other than the current time period. So once again, if you're working in the current time period, many of these things might be very useful to give you basically reminders and whatnot. However, if you're entering data for a whole year or something like that, and you're not always in the current time period, then it might be a problem. When you're working with a practice problem like this, it could be a problem. So we're going to turn most of these off so we don't get reminders for them. So just to go through them, we have the checks to print. So we have the show summary, show list, or don't remind, and then we have the days before the check date in order to help you out for that, so you can set up this default setting for it. Checks to print, once again, show the summary, the show the list, don't remind, the default is the show the summary, and then you can alter the days from 5 days before the check date. Invoice, the credit memos to print, once again, you can take a look at the days before the invoice date for the reminder. Overdue invoices, we have the days after the due date. Almost due invoices, we're going to have the days before the due date. And then we have the sales receipts to print. We have the inventory to record. And we've got the bills to pay days before the due date. We got the memorized transactions days before the due date. And the money to deposit, the purchase orders to print, and the to-do notes. Once again, these are probably useful, and they may not throw us off with the problem so much as some of the other reminders because they are tied to, of course, due dates. But I'm going to go ahead and turn these off given the fact that we have a practice problem and we won't always be in the current period. We may be entering things that's not exactly in the date order, but in order by cycle, and therefore the days might throw us off a bit for the reminders. So I'm going to turn these off so we don't have to deal with them here. You can test them out and test those different settings within your practice to see if they are going to be something that would be useful to you within your bookkeeping process. We're then going to go to the reports and graphs. As we do so, it's going to say, hey, you made some changes. Do you want to save them? And we're going to say, yes, we would like to save those changes. Then we have the two tabs here. We're in the My Preferences tab now. Defaults are here. Prompt me to modify report options before opening a report. So do we want to have a prompt that's going to tell you to modify the report options before? I like the default as not being checked. Then we have the reports and graphs. When a report or graph needs to be refreshed, prompt me to refresh it or refresh automatically. Now, this meaning if we're in something like a balance sheet or a profit and loss statement, then we go to the check register, let's say, and we make a change, go back to the balance sheet or profit and loss. Do we want to have to tell the system, hey, make the change, or would we like it to refresh automatically? Personally, I like it to refresh automatically. And so I'm going to say refresh automatically. Click help for information about refreshing a large report. And then we have the graphs. We have the draw graphs in 2D or use patterns. And so I'm going to keep the defaults there. Then we'll go to the company preferences. Company preferences, summary reports on the accrual or cash method. The accrual method is typically preferred. Even if you think you're going to run your information more in a cash method, you probably want to keep it on the accrual method. And let me explain that just for a bit. Obviously, the cash method means that cash is driving when revenue and expenses are reported. Accrual means that we're going to be driven by the income method or the revenue recognition method and the expense recognition method. At the point in time we basically earn the revenue and the point in time that we incur the expense in essence. So it takes more, however, than just checking one of these two items for us to be on really a full cash or accrual method. We would have to then also enter the data into the system in alignment with a cash or an accrual method. And if you want to utilize any type of account that would be on a balance sheet or an accrual kind of account, such as accounts receivable, then you're typically more on an accrual method. So in other words, even if you enter data basically straight from your check register or your bank statement into the system and you're saying, hey, I'm just entering the cash transactions into the bank system, you probably still, even though you're doing that and you're entering data as if you're on a cash method, and you are on a cash method to some degree with that type of method, still want to generally enter the accrual or keep the default as the accrual. And we'll talk a little bit more about this as we start, of course, to enter the transactions. Note that you can change these at any time, and QuickBooks will basically make the changes. But again, QuickBooks is making the changes based on kind of the triggering factors as to when something would be recorded within QuickBooks to make those changes. Again, we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but just note that you can change those. You're not really stuck to one or the other if you choose one. I would keep the accrual as the default, as we will here. Then we have the aging report. Age from the due date or age from the transaction date will keep the default. And then we have the reports show items by either name only, description only, name and description. I like to have the name and description. That is the default. Reports show accounts by name only, description only, name and description. So if we have the accounts, we're going to keep here basically just the name only on the accounts. I'll keep the default setting. And then we have the statement of cash flow classifications. We'll go into that a little bit more detail when we get to the statement of cash flows. We're not going to change any of the settings at this point. Collapse transactions. Select this checkbox to collapse multiple items in a transactions into a single line. This could save space if you don't have a lot of screen space that you're looking at, or you like to see things more cleanly on the screen. I think it's easier not to have that checked, as is the default, and therefore I will keep that as is. That's all the changes we will make here. We're going to say OK, and then we'll continue on next time.